All right, well, I show 1 o'clock, so we can get this started. Welcome. My name is Matt Rabel, and this is the Octa Developer Office Hours. We try to do this once a month, where we basically get part of our Octa Developer Advocate team together to answer questions from the community, as well as anything that comes in from Twitter or LinkedIn or anything real time. And so welcome. If you're here today, this is our Java specific one. And so we want to just mostly entertain Java questions related to the Java ecosystem, as well as security, OAuth, and all that kind of stuff. So we have multiple streams going. We have the Zoom stream, we have the YouTube stream, and I'll be taking questions as they come in, repeating them here, and then talking to Micah, Brian, or myself, and getting those answered for you. So let's begin here.
I think the YouTube stream isn't quite ready yet.
No? Well, I was
it still says waiting.
Oh, you might be going to the wrong one, because it gave me it is live.
Yeah, I see that on your screen.
So I have this link here. I can put it into the QA maybe. No, we have no questions there, but is there a chat here?
Chat in the Zoom. You can also throw it in our Slack.
I'll put it in an internal Slack. So here's that URL there that I see anyway. So you want to try that one, see if that's working. I have this link here. I can put it into.
Yeah, that's working.
QA,
that's good.
Maybe. So there might be 2 of them out there. If someone wants to log into YouTube and kill the second one, I don't know. But I'll get started with the question. So the first question I have here asks, should I use the Octa Spring Boot starter instead of the Spring Security starter? So what I'm guessing this question is asking is, you can actually use the Spring Security starter and even some OAuth starters as well to add OAuth security to your Spring Boot applications. So Brian, you want to take this one?
Sure. So this is a it depends type of answer. So you can use Spring Security out of the box. It'll work just fine. It works great. So what the Octa starter adds is a couple things. There's a little bit of sugar as far as making it easier for configuration, but there's also the fact that we validate our JWTs a little more strictly because, and this goes back into some more OAuth specific things. JWT validation in a OAuth implementation isn't really per spec, right? It just ends up being more of a convention. So our Spring Boot starter validates some of the Octa specific claims, whereas the generic Spring Security validates just more general, like this is what the industry is doing. So that's still fine. And also, as of Spring Security 5.2, you can also use opaque tokens, which is the per spec. Makes a request out to the remote IDP and then back again, and that would work the same way either one.
Okay.
So I would say it depends.
I have a question. Is there anything specific in our starter that would make it not work with someone other than Octa? So if you want to use like Keycloak or something like that, are we doing anything Octa specific?
You should be able to use, you should be able to mix IDPs. Spring Security supports, you can have N number of IDPs. So it should work. I haven't tried it. There is a lot of guarding in the code to make sure, if this is an Octa request, just to do the Octa specific stuff at that point.
Okay. The reason I asked that is we actually use the Spring Security starters in JHipster, and we allow you to talk to Keycloak or Octa. We don't have anything, Octa specific in there, and those work just fine. And my experience is, if you want to maintain, 3 or 4 dependencies and 11 lines of YAML instead of 3 or 1 dependency and 3 lines, right? Then that's the difference. But it's good to hear there's other validation and a little more security in there. All right. So moving on to the next question here. Should I use SAML or OAuth for my application? So let's give this one to Micah.
Yeah, sure. I get that question a lot, and the best answer, the unsatisfying answer is it depends, but I always like to ask, is the app that you're building going to have a backing API, or will it have a backing API? And if you know up front, that might help to clarify. So just in general, SAML is a little more heavyweight. It's a little more dated, but it's perfectly fine still as a standard for single sign-on. What you get with OpenID Connect and OAuth, in addition to single sign-on, is you get the ability to access backing APIs on behalf of an authenticated user. So for customers that are building an app from scratch that are going to have a backing API, you can have the same technology end to end if you use OpenID Connect and OAuth. Whereas if they use SAML for the single sign-on piece, SAML is just not well suited for backing APIs. So you'd have to use SAML and then something else for your backing APIs, and that would most likely be OAuth. So depending on the app that you're building and you know, there are other considerations as well, but that's a good first line to look at is, are you going to have a backing API? And at least in my experience, in most cases, the answer tends to be yes for modern applications, because they want to get an economy of scale. So if you're building a new app, you're probably building a mobile app and web app, maybe a desktop app, and you want to be using a backing API so that you can reuse that backend code in all those different contexts. So in most cases, for most modern apps, OAuth and OpenID Connect is going to be a better bet. And I've even had conversations where a customer will say, well, we're a SAML shop. We already know SAML. And depending on the app that they're building, you know, my answer is often, well, you might be better off taking on that learning curve now for OpenID Connect and OAuth, and then having the same technology end to end, than to start building with SAML and then later on have to learn OAuth anyway to deal with your API.
So if you have a web app, SAML works great, but anything else, like, you probably want to investigate OpenID Connect.
Yeah.
So good
say.
news is, hey, Octa supports both. All right.
Yeah, we have a question here in chat on the YouTube channel. If I want to add it to my simple JSP and servlet-based web app, is it possible to do so? You want to jump on this one, Brian?
Sure. So there's definitely a couple ways to do this. So it depends on whatever existing framework you're using may already support OAuth. So if so, you just, you know, read that documentation. Since Octa is, you know, just implements the OAuth standard, like Mike said, SAML, OAuth, OIDC, you could just use whatever client off the shelf, and you don't have to use any of our specific libraries. So again, that depends. There are a few ways to make things easier for legacy applications. If you're not using existing security framework, or if a framework doesn't support you, you can even use Spring Security in Spring Boot in a non-Spring app, although it's kind of wrapped around things to make it even easier.
Yeah, and I would just like to clarify, when we're talking about it in this context, if we're referring back to OAuth and OpenID Connect, everything that Brian said is accurate. But also, if we're talking about the Java SDK to work with the Octa API, then that's just a Java library that you can drop into any Java application, where it could be standalone, it could be JSP, it could be servlet. So that you can use in any context.
Yep.
Right. And there's also we have a specific Java Auth SDK, right? That's for people that are just like, I want bare bones and I want to send username and passwords. I don't want to do any OAuth flow dance or anything like that. So there's all kinds of options there. I mean, one of the easiest ones is we have a filter, right? A JWT verifier filter that you can add to your servlet apps. And that's just for validating JWT. So if you had an Angular app or a React app, you know, or even a mobile app, and you just wanted to send a JWT and you wanted to, you know, maybe you're creating a REST API with JSP. It's not a great idea, but you could do it. You could do that way as well. Otherwise, if it's like JSP servlets, you know, and you want to actually have a JSP that serves up a login form, you could do that with our sign-in widget. So there's nothing really preventing you from getting access tokens in a regular JSP application. All right, so go back to looking at our questions. I got one here. Do you offer any integration with micro profile? I'll take that one since Brian took the last one. That's very similar to the servlet story in the sense of we have a filter, JWT verifier filter that you could use, or it's actually a library that you could, write a filter around. But micro profile actually has JWT support built in. So there's two different components. One is what they call just a JWT authentication, and that is pretty simple to use. There's two properties that you specify in application.properties file, and one is like the issuer URI, and the other one is the keys for the Jwts. And so those keys will rotate. That's why there's an endpoint instead of actually downloading them into your project. And so we support that. We have, if you Google for Octa micro profile, you'll find a post on how to do that. And I did try, there's also an OpenID plugin or an OIDC plugin for micro profile. And so apparently you can use this as well if you wanted authentication. So the Jwt one, that just validates tokens as they come in, whereas authentication would actually like redirect you to Octa to log in and then come back. And that exists. I haven't tried it, but I did have a good friend point that out and be like, hey, if you want to do it with Korkis, which is, a micro profile framework, then there is that option. And what we see a lot is that typically people building, micro profile applications, they're building APIs. They're not building web apps with templates and JSPs and stuff like that in them. So, yeah. So yes, the answer is yes.
Very cool.
So next question. What is the difference between all of the Octa Java libraries? So this seems like a good one for Brian since he's written a lot of them.
Yeah, so Octa has a handful of libraries. So sort of our big ones are our management SDK, which is more your typical CRUD operations, create users, groups, applications, those types of more management functions. And then we also have our Spring Boot starter, which we've talked about. That's more of a this is the easiest way to get going in the Spring world with Octa. So the big difference there, obviously, is one is meant for OAuth in your web app. The other one could be used anywhere. It could be used, you could build a command line application, some backend service, some REST API, whatever you have to do. You could use that. And then we also have, as Matt mentioned, JWT validator, which is more of I need to plug Octa's JWT validation into my existing framework. And that's just the Java library with very few dependencies that you can just drop in and use, with a couple lines of code. And we have a authentication API, which again, Matt mentioned, which is more the bare bones, low level stuff, which is great for, if you're migrating off of some service or you're splitting. So, you're trying to figure out if, as you're migrating to a different service like Octa, you maybe want to send Octa user registrations and logins to Octa, and then you still have some other third party or homegrown code that you want to split out. So a lot of times it's easier to do that, in your Java code, and that's also used in our Android library, which I don't do a whole lot with, but you can do like a native form login, like build your own form in Android, and you can do a web view login. And what else do we have? Oh, we also have a hooks library that is new and up and coming to help out with if you're building responses to Octa's hooks. I think that's everything.
Are there any others that are like in development or upcoming, or are most of them feature complete and there's not much roadmap?
No, so there's a lot of other things that we're trying to work on. So obviously, trying to improve existing libraries, right? I know Mike and I have been talking a lot about with Les Hazelwood, the founder of JGWT. So we're sort of updating that library as well. So these are sort of tangent libraries, as well as supporting the new Paceto spec. So there's a lot of things like that are on our roadmap as well. And I've been itching to add some things into Spring Security.
So it's not Paceto?
I don't know how you say it. I just assumed it's Paceto. I think that's what I've been told.
You're right.
But
yeah, every time I read it though, I'm like, Paste 2? What?
Yeah, I pasta.
Okay. Let's see here. What should I use in conjunction with Okta's Java tools when building a spa? Micah, you've created several spas. What would you answer?
Yeah, I mean, the short story there is we have libraries for all of the popular browser-based web frameworks. So uh, Vue.js, Angular, React. Those are the big ones, right? And we have
Yep.
libraries for all of those. So it's slightly off topic of Java, but since spas are kind of the mainstream, you can use our libraries really, and they integrate very well with the Spring Boot backend. And one thing that I haven't kind of jumped into myself, but I plan on doing, in the next couple of months, is to use JHipster both with our JavaScript and our Java libraries. And you might have more experience with that, Matt, but if I were going to start a spa from scratch outside of JHipster, I work a lot in Vue.js. I would grab, fire up a Vue.js project, drop in the Octa Vue.js library, set up my Spring Boot backend, drop in the Octa Spring Boot starter, and then I'd have, end to end off and be ready to build the app. It's kind of a tangential question, but maybe you can answer, Matt. If I wanted to do the same thing in JHipster, is there a command line ready to go for that, or would I fire up a JHipster with my front end of choice? Because I know it supports Angular and Vue at least, maybe React as well. But can you specify Octa right out of the gate, or do you need to like add some stuff in after?
So great question. So the question was, how do you do this in JHipster? JHipster is an application generator that generates a Spring Boot backend. There's actually .NET and Node.js backends now as well. But I like the Java one because that's Spring Boot, and I love Spring Boot. But yeah, so what I started doing shortly after I started with Octo was integrating Octa into JHipster, and it was more of a, adding OAuth to JHipster. And what I discovered when I did that was that the OAuth support that we had in JHipster was actually setting up like an authorization server, because Spring Boot actually allowed you to build an authorization server. And then on the client side, it was like Angular code at the time because we didn't support React or Vue, and it was sending like an client ID and a client secret from the front end to the back end, and like getting JWTs and doing all that. And I was like, there's, it's TypeScript code, not JavaScript code, but eventually JavaScript that was actually having the client secret in there. I was like, hey, I've only been here for 6 months, but apparently this is something that you should never do, right? And so when I found that, I was like, oh my, right? Because I had written a Stormpath plugin when we were at Stormpath for JHipster, and it was a little bit different, right? Because you weren't actually integrating like, OAuth, you were just adding Stormpath. And so when I saw the OAuth support was actually like doing it wrong, I was like, okay, we gotta, take this out and do it right. And so it's actually been controversial, and we still get people that ask, why are you doing it this way? But we let the server side do everything. And the reason we do that is because, first of all, it makes it easier to support all the clients, right? And also JHipster by default packages everything together. So even though you have an Angular app, right, it's packaged in your Spring Boot app. And even if you used a CDN and actually, pulled it apart, like it's still going to have like a cookie communication between the front end and the back end. So the nice thing about that is we don't have to worry about implementing it for React or for Vue or anything like that. And it just leverages Spring security. And when you click on a link on the front end that's in React or Vue or whatever, it redirects to the back end. The back end does OAuth dance, and then it just returns a cookie to the client, and then they can, talk to each other. So we've had people come in and be like, I want to make this stateless, and therefore I want to use JWTs, and I want to use an OIDC library in Angular to do it that way. And I just tell them like, you can, but wouldn't it be more fun to not maintain, authentication in your front end and just let the back end handle it? So that's how we do it. And the thing that we did set up, which is kind of nice, is by default, it's also an OAuth 2 resource server. So if you were to somehow get an OAuth token in your client and pass it into the back end, that would work as well. It's just not by default. And so we have like an Ionic generator that I wrote for JHipster that you can generate a PWA that uses Angular and Ionic, and you never even put it on a phone, right? You just put it on a browser. that will actually talk to that JHipster backend, and that JHipster backend will automatically parse that, authorization header and make that whole thing work. So we just try to do it the more secure way. And I've had people come in and like rip it all out and do it all on the Angular side. And I'm like, no, this is, it's good, it works, but if we can be more secure and do everything on the back end, then that seems a good default.
Yeah,
Nice.
that's a great answer, and I didn't actually know that. And for people on the line, that's actually the best security posture to have if you have a SPA app that has a backing application server. So if you have a pure SPA app and it must have a token, then you have to do it in the SPA app. But if you have a Spring Boot backend or some other backend, the best security posture is to let the backend deal with the tokens and then just use the session cookie to manage communication between the SPA and the backend. So that's really awesome. I'll have to dig into that.
Yeah.
Before we change topics too, I do want to point out Octa has a lot of blog posts that we talk a lot about. You have a Spring Boot backend plus X front end. So I know we have Vue and a few different versions of Angular and a few other things out there too. So if there's something specific that we didn't cover, definitely check out the blog.
Yep. Great advice. All right. So here's one. Which JDKs is the Java SDK optimized for? So as you know, there's many Java SDKs available now, and you can choose all the way from Java 7 to Java 14. You want to take that one, Brian?
Sure. So I'll take this. So in my opinion, I was saying this before our call here, there's really two versions of Java that people really care about as far as I'm probably going to be ostracized for saying this, but there's Java 8, which many of us are still on, and there's Java 11. And really the big difference came around Java 9, right? So there's sort of pre-8, 8, and post-8, if you really think about it that way. But our libraries are built for Java 8, and we test with 8 and 11. So there are a few things, like I said, post 8, starting with Java 9, there are a few different changes to some libraries, and some things were pulled out of the JDK. So, but we test with both of those versions. So we assume that things will work going forward. However, if somebody reports some bug that came out with one of the newer versions, we'd probably try to look at it because there's probably still some backwards compatible fix. But like I said, for the most part, 8 and 11 are ruling the day.
Okay. And is there any plans to make a different baseline, like Java 11 the baseline, or?
I would love to, but I sort of think that the industry is going to be stuck on 8 for a while. I mean, if you look at Android, there's a lot of Java development on Android that's still not at 8; it's at 6 or 7, and that's going back to even Java 7 is mind-numbingly frustrating at points, just because there's a lot of things to do to migrate your APIs stably, right? Like default interface methods, and there's a lot of little things like that in streams for is the other big one that you can't do before 8, and I don't want to go back there.
And
So
one
is
thing
it-
we should
Go
add
ahead.
is even though we test with 8 and 11, there's no reason that it shouldn't work with 9 or 14 or anything else that's post 8, right?
Absolutely.
Right. What about Java modules? Are you using Java modules at all in our SDKs?
No, so that's another thing that has come up a couple times, especially with people that are doing, obviously want to use newer versions of Java, but then with folks that are like the OSGI folks, right? So I did find a few different ways that you can support sort of Java 9 plus modules with Java 8. You basically just compile a couple files with Java, Java 9 or 11, and just package it all into the same jar. So that way, if you have a newer JVM, it can read those files, and your older JVMs would just ignore them. So I have thought about doing that, but it's not on the top of my list.
So I did hear something interesting recently. Java 8, right, is now ubiquitously adopted pretty much, right? There's only a few stragglers. And Java 11 seems like it's having a little adoption problems, right? Like people aren't, adopting it quickly. And the interesting thing that I read was that Java 8 had a really long adoption sequence. It took several years, and they were very worried in the beginning, just like we are now with Java 11, that people weren't going to upgrade, right? And I think, they eventually did. So just to say that, the situation we're experiencing now with more rapid releases and people not upgrading isn't really new. It's kind of, the Java ecosystem in general.
Oh, for sure. Especially, when you factor in the old, J2EE sort of, that was, 2 years behind
Right.
all the other JVMs, right? So,
Yep. All right. So you did mention Android and Java 8. And Android now uses Kotlin, right, as their first class language, or they have first class language support. And I believe part of the reason for that is, maybe it's Google and Oracle and the API, like copyright case and stuff like that. But I don't think that Google will actually make anything above Java 8 work on Android, right? Because why would they invest in Java, right? This company over here keeps suing them every time they do. So Kotlin, seems like a better choice. So the question here is, the reason I brought it up is, does your Octa Java SDK support Kotlin?
yes. So it's a little tricky on Android, again, because so the way Kotlin works, so Kotlin will compile whatever current version. It can target an older JVM. So if you're writing Kotlin with all the newer syntax, you can actually just target an older JVM, and your classes will be compatible with the older JVM. So taking Android out of the picture, things just work because it's all just Java bytecode, and everything's beautiful. So you have to be careful on Android if you don't support. I think it's Android 23 or 21, or I forget which version it is, that starts with the Java 1.8 support. But other than that, anything Kotlin should just work with any other Java bytecode out of the box.
So there's nothing specific you need to do for Kotlin to work with any of our libraries?
Nope.
Okay, cool. All right. Let's see here. Since we're talking about the JDK and newer versions, does the Java SDK work with Java 9 and beyond? Like, is there any issues there? Or
nope. So as mentioned before, we test with 8 and 11. So there was definitely a few issues that I found. Pretty much every project that I've ever worked on, switching from migrating up from 8. But it's all like XML parsing libraries you have to add back in, or there's a lot of Maven plugins that are sort of third-party Maven plugins that sort of don't work great with newer JVM. So there's a lot of tweaking you have to do there. And I assume Gradle's the same way. But that's mostly because those plugin providers haven't updated yet. And if I'm remembering right, even Maven itself, I think, is targeting Java 1.7. And there's been talk in that community to at least get to 8, because nobody wants to deal with older code anymore.
Right. So while we're speaking of versions in Java, I remember that our Spring Boot starter, between Spring Boot 2.1 and 2.2, we had to have some changes in there, right? It was like we had our starter 1.2.2, and then 1.3.0 is for Spring Boot 2.2. Do you remember what changed between Spring 2.1 and 2.2?
Yeah, I forget the class exactly, but we were depending on fairly low level stuff, right? Because we're sort of really close to the Spring security layer. Most applications operate a few layers above, which is great, because if you can push all that stuff into some framework and not worry about it, that's way better. So one of the classes that we were compiling against changed in a backwards incompatible way. So it was source compatible, but not binary compatible. So it took me a little while to find, because the code compiled, in the old version and the new version just fine. But if you had an old binary, it wouldn't work with the newer binary. So it was a minor breaking change in Spring Security that we had to update to.
Okay. So in that case, it was something like a runtime error, right?
Yep.
Try the old library. Okay. Because I did an upgrade for Spring Security, Spring Boot in JHipster, we migrated to 2.2 just a few weeks ago. And the reason for that was we waited till Spring Cloud came out, and that was, lagging a couple months behind Spring Boot. And what I found was that doing a granted authorities mapper and using Spring Security 5.2, I guess it was, it would return a different class for scopes. It used to just return roles, and now it returns like scopes as well. So I think, that's something that they changed. I think our starter was always doing that, right? You had some code custom logic to do that.
Yep.
So I just had to do an instance of, but that's because in JHipster, we're not, using our starter. So maybe we should. I would have less code to write,
Nice.
All right. So we got one from YouTube here. Why should I choose Octa Spring Boot Starter instead of Spring Security OAuth 2 auto configure? So I can take this one because I've spent a lot of time with the OAuth 2 auto configure. And I think even Mike has written a blog post on this. So let me know if you want to jump in. I'll just do a quick answer here, Micah. The reason that I would say is with the Spring Security OAuth 2 auto configure, there's annotations like enable OAuth 2 SSO or something like that, and enable resource server. So they're annotations you can use. Spring Security basically deprecated those and said Spring Boot gave us those. Those aren't really our annotations, but we'll continue to support them, and we'll go ahead and make it so you can do the configuration of OAuth, whether it's OAuth 2 SSO or it's enable resource server. We're going to do that as part of the Spring Security DSL. Do you have anything to add on top of that, Micah?
Yeah, I think the only other thing, and it's really just kind of a convenience, is you don't need as many configuration properties if you use the Octa Spring Boot Starter. I forget exactly which other ones you need if you don't use the Octa Spring Boot Starter. Brian may know, but with the Octa Spring Boot Starter, you just need the issuer and the client ID and client secret, and that's it.
Right. And so we don't use the Spring Security OAuth 2 auto configure in JHipster. We just use the Roth, I think it's Spring Security OAuth 2 client and OAuth 2 resource server. Now they're separate dependencies. And yeah, the configuration is, is that much versus that much. So.
Right. But I do want to stress what Matt said. The big thing to me would be, especially with the OAuth 2 auto configure, is it's a deprecated library. So that whole OAuth project used to be separate outside of Spring Security. And in, was it Spring Boot or Spring Security 5.1 or 5.0, that was all moved inside of the project. So now it's no longer a redheaded stepchild or however you want.
And the interesting thing that happened with the Spring Security project recently was they announced, I think a month ago, that they were no longer going to allow you to build a Spring or just an OAuth 2 authorization server with Spring Security. They were like, it's been possible in the past, but we're not really in the product business, and we'd rather just develop libraries. And the response on their blog post was so fervent that people were like, no, like we use this and stuff. And so I think they actually had to reconsider. And now they're like,
oh, wow.
We might change things around, and there's so many people that appear to be using this that I think we'll still do it.
Yeah, I mean, I work at Octa, right? I have a biased opinion, but I definitely think if you don't have to host your own IDP, you probably shouldn't, right?
Right. And I think part of it was they were in that blog post saying, if you want an open source, authorization server, just use Keycloak, right?
Yep.
Which is great. You can run it in a Docker container, and that's what we used for JHipster, and it's awesome. But I think people are saying like, yeah, that's great, but with Spring Security, you can do it in 50 lines of code, right? So why do I want to download this whole open source project when I can do it, with Spring Security? So I can see both sides, but I, like you, try not to let friends write their own authorization servers.
Exactly.
All right, so we have one from YouTube here. What are your thoughts on using Pixie PKCE code flow instead of auth code flow in backend libraries like Java and .NET? And so our resident Pixie expert here, Micah, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. And this is actually something I recently learned myself, because I've only ever used Pixie on SPA type apps. But it turns out there is an advantage, and that is in a context where you already have a client ID and a client secret, like you typically would on a backend app like Spring Boot. There's still an advantage to using Pixie in conjunction with that, and that is for CSRF. That the code verifier and the code challenge are only used once, even though you're still using the client ID, the fixed client ID and secret. And so you really get the benefit of both worlds. You get the benefit of the regular authorization code flow, which is authenticating the client to the server. So authenticating your Spring Boot app to, say, Octa. That's the benefit of the fixed client secret there. But you also get the benefit of the dynamic secret in the code verifier and the code challenge from Pixie. And that's very useful for things like CSRF. It'll only occur once, and you can validate that value as an extra check, and you can guard against things like replay attacks or XSRF type of attacks from external sources. So I haven't personally done an example with Pixie on the back end yet. It's something I have on my to-do list now that I've learned this new information. But we spoke with a colleague of ours who contributes to the standards body, and it's kind of a subtle use case, but one that is valuable. So both authorization code flow and authorization code flow with Pixie all at once. So you're still using the client secret, and you're also using the code verifier and the code challenge.
All right. Thank you. All right, so here's one. If I have an existing Java app that uses a different OAuth provider, what do I need to do to use Octa instead? Anyone want to take this one?
I'll try to jump into that one. So assuming you're using a library that supports OAuth, it should just be configuration. Obviously, that depends on how you're using that library, right? And if you're doing anything sort of IDP specific. But if you're just using some library, I know if you switch between, say, Google or Facebook and Octave with Spring Security, it's just configuration changes. Everything else just works. Spring Security, or again, other frameworks are smart enough to know to go to, redirect to a different IDP, and you come back and your application code is still the same.
And I think from what I've seen, just in the Java library space, a lot of times it depends on whether your library like supports OpenID Connect or just OAuth. Because with just OAuth, you might have to specify a number of different endpoints for authorization, for the token, for the introspection, all that. And with OpenID Connect, you just talk to a single endpoint, what's called an issuer, and then it downloads a document that has all that information in it. So that might be a difference. Whereas Octa, you might have less configuration. With another service, you might have more.
Yep, and there's also so if you're migrating off of one, right, and you still have users on the other one, Octa does provide some options for you to do that too. That we probably don't need to go in here, but there's definitely some other options where we can help you migrate from one IDP to another and still not have any downtime.
Okay, cool. So I got one here that I think we've kind of answered, but how do I use Octa in Java apps that don't use Spring? So good maybe segue here would be, what about like a Java FX app? Because that's a Java app that certainly probably doesn't use Spring. How would you do it there?
So Java FX is a little tricky, right? Because it's again, it's client code. And I haven't really used Java on the desktop since the days of Swing, and I used to love writing Swing code. If you remember that.
One of those, huh?
Yeah, I loved it. Everything was the same. It was before sort of the Web 2.0 where everything was styled a certain way. But no, you could literally follow a document. You didn't have to be artsy and creative. That was my sweet spot right there. So I know at least for Java FX, I've seen a couple OAuth libraries. I assume they open up a browser and then redirect back. So the way I've seen this done is very similar to, again, a mobile client. Is you redirect to, you fire off a browser, you go do the OAuth login, maybe you have a second factor, and then that application will redirect back to your desktop application. And on a mobile device, it ends up being in the URL. I know Mac supports it. I assume Linux and Windows support that as well. And then you have some sort of inbound hook in your desktop app to handle, validating the remaining piece. So I know there are a couple libraries to do that. I haven't played with any of them, but it's all very possible. I have played with some command line options. So there's a couple OAuth flows that will really help out with that. I know like there's a device code flow, which is what you use when you log into Netflix or Amazon, or not Amazon, sorry. Yeah, Amazon Prime from your TV. You go to some other machine, you type in the code, those types of flows. Obviously, that's not really great for a Java FX app. But if you're building, like I said, a command line app, that type of flow could work for you.
Right. So we do have I remembered because I helped edit the article. There is a tutorial that we have. So if you Google for Java FX Octa, it comes up with this blog post about how to build a Java FX desktop app with OIDC and Octa. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that uses a library from Microsoft, but it only works with Java 1.8 and only Oracle's Java 1.8, because that's the only version of the SDK or OpenJDK or anything that actually has Java FX in it. So since then, I think with Java FX 11 or OpenJDK 11, it's a separate project, right? And it doesn't work with that library, but there's also this company called Gluon that's really taken a leadership role in Java FX and made it so it works on like Android and iOS and everything. So in that case, what I would say is you could probably use our Auth SDK, which would mean building your own login form in Java FX and then talking to our Auth API directly, right? The only problem there is you're not using standards like OIDC and OpenID Connect, but a lot of times on the phones, you have to actually pop a browser and redirect. And some people building those mobile apps don't want to give developers those or consumers that experience, right? They want to be able to username, password, and Face ID and make all that work. So, a couple options there. So.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that also is it's kind of outside the question of our specific SDKs, but once you are using a standard like OpenID Connect, something like Java FX would be really the perfect use case for Pixie. And then it just becomes an exchange, like Brian said, with capturing the result of a browser and exchanging an authorization code for a set of tokens. So although it's kind of outside the realm of our SDK specifically, it's pretty easy to accomplish. And we have a couple of examples that I'll post in the chat on the YouTube live stream. Brian also mentioned the code flow or the device flow. And if you're not familiar with that, we have a good blog post on that. So I'll paste both of those into the YouTube chat. I just pasted the device flow one, and that's how you can add the device flow to any application using Octa. So it's not specifically our Java SDKs in that case, but it is kind of an approach that's aligned with the standards. And since Octa supports those standards, you can use Octa directly in those sort of contexts.
Cool. All right, so we got another question on how to add Android authentication. So I'm going to share my screen here and just show you some examples. Last time I tried to do this, I couldn't figure it out, but hopefully it won't be that hard this time. So here we go. This is, if you look at the URL there, it's Octa/samples Android. And so if you have an Android app and you want to add Octa for authentication, there's a number of different examples here. There's a browser sign-in, right, which pops a web browser, does the redirect dance, just like you've experienced in a normal browser whenever you log in with any social account. Very similar to that, looks and acts the same. Then there's this custom sign-in here that is a little more customizable. This would be like if you're doing Java FX and you just wanted to, use our Auth API. But this also has like multi-factor authentication. using either, SMS or a phone call or Google Authenticator, or even our product called Okta Verify, which is really nice to use. And I believe there's even WebAuthn support. So obviously in Android, it would be different because WebAuthn is from the browser. But then there's even a sign in with Kotlin here and a Totp generator as well. So all those are available for Android, to answer that question. And then
I added that repo into the YouTube chat as well, Matt.
Okay. So now I got to figure out how to stop sharing. New share, stop share. There we go. Okay. All right. So that answers a question about Android. Here's one. Why should I use the Java SDK and not a Java HTTP client to make direct API calls? So I believe this is in reference to the fact that Octa has a REST API that if you want to construct your own code to just call that directly, you can. When we all started here, we came from a company called Stormpath. This was almost I think it'll be 3 years ago.
Yeah, in February.
And Octa had a REST API, and that was most of what they provided for developers. And we came from Stormpath. And Stormpath, we took a different approach. We had a REST API, but we also developed all these specific SDKs for the various languages. And what we found was developers loved it, right? In the sense of, figuring out a REST API doc and figuring out how to do HTTP client versus, actually just learning the API for Java code. Developers loved it. And so why should you use the Java SDK? Well, because you like Java and, you don't like figuring out endpoints and reading REST endpoint documentation. That would be my case, but Brian, you've written the Java SDK, so why would you recommend that people use it, or what advantages are there over talking directly to the API?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely, a Java preference versus going to figure out, the REST API, parsing the response, serializing it. Obviously, there are libraries out there that'll do that for you, right?
Right.
What is it? Spring's REST template or whatever it's called now. Does what's that?
The web client, the reactive one?
Yes. The web client. So a lot of that can be done for you. So for simple requests, maybe that's your, the 3-minute option or the right. But if you're doing anything serious, you probably want to use a library that's sort of dedicated towards that, right? So you don't have to go write anything. You don't have to create wrapper objects. You don't have to do all of this song and dance because somebody's done that for you. Plus, the SDK adds caching. It does retries. You can configure how you respond to request throttling. Right. So maybe you want to retry the request 5 times. Maybe you want to do X times within 2 minutes. Right. So if you have a sort of a backend service and you could throttle that really slowly, that's fine. You could do that. If you have a user-faced service where you need to respond, within a small period of time, maybe you only want to retry once. So you could do a lot of those things. All that's built in for you, so you don't have to write it. So that's my big pitch.
Yeah, Magette pointed out on YouTube that error handling and rate limiting is included in the Java SDK, which is important. And just to piggyback on what Brian was saying on the caching layer, the cache that's built into the SDK is a production ready cache, as long as you're in a single JVM environment, but it's also pluggable, meaning that if you are in a multi JVM environment, you have some sort of distributed environment, load balancer, whatever, you can drop in Redis or Hazelcast or something else to use as a caching layer, and it'll just plug into the Java SDK. So that's another wheel you don't have to reinvent.
Yep.
You wanted to go on your own.
Yep. So also with that, so our SDK is not specific to Spring, right? It doesn't have any Spring dependencies, but we do have the option if you drop that in with one of our Spring starter, or you use the SDK Spring integration, that will configure the SDK to use Spring Cache. So whatever Spring Cache implementation you're using would just work with the SDK as well.
So I've written some code that uses our Okta Java SDK in a Spring Boot app. And I remember all I had to do was generate like a token, right? And then put that in my properties file and then actually just inject a client into the constructor, right? Is that typically all you have to do?
Yep.
So
Yep. You
yeah, that
just
was a
need,
great experience. And then, you know, it was like list users or call user by an email, and even by the principal, I think you could just pass that in directly JavaX security principal and get, you know, you're talking to Okta. So that's pretty cool. So related to that, talking about API keys, putting in an application properties file, API keys, kind of like secrets, are not to be stored in source control, especially if it's in a public repo. So question here is, what is the best practice for storing the Okta API key for use with the Java SDK?
yeah. So sort of a future hint, right? So for applications that are using OAuth access tokens in the future, hopefully near future, we'll be able to use the access token instead of an API key. So you can manage that same request flow from whatever, you know, in the scope of that user. So right now the SDK works with an API key, you know, which would either be global to your application or however you have that configured. So one of the best ways is probably using something like Vault or some other secure storage to get the key into your application. So obviously, definitely not system properties unless you're injecting system properties some other way, like a Java agent or something that's not on the command line. So the big issue is put on the command line, you can get the you can run like a PS and see the arguments. You could use environment variables. Obviously, again, that's not that's definitely better than putting on the command line, but it's also still, you know, every forked process or anything still has access to that those environment variables. So something like Vault or some other secure storage would definitely be the way to go.
So when you say Vault, I've heard of Spring Vault and I've heard of HashiCorp Vault. Or are you using a generic term for Vault? Or
Yeah, so Vault, so HashiCorp Vault, so Spring Vault can access HashiCorp's Vault and deal with all the leasing and the complexities of HashiCorp's Vault for you. And there's a great little tutorial. I think it's even in a GitHub README from the Spring Vault project, which basically just downloads like a single binary from HashiCorp, starts it up, tells you how to, like, you know, the 5-minute overview of this is how you run a Vault server, and then you can play with it that way. So I would definitely check that out if you haven't seen it, and if you have some other way to store secrets, that, you know, that's fine too.
Right, and I think one of our coworkers, Randal, always talks about some AWS service that.
Yeah, KMS.
Yep.
Yeah, we use KMS quite a lot internally, and that's a good place to store something like sensitive API keys as well. And the this is outside of Octa, but the Java libraries to deal with KMS are pretty straightforward and easy to use.
Cool.
Is there a Spring config or Spring Cloud config plugin to use KMS?
I don't know. I bet there is, but
I was going to say, I'm guessing there is. Inquiring minds want to know.
All right, so there's another question here. Can any of your SDKs be used for newer frameworks like Micronaut and Korkis?
Yeah, so all of our SDKs, except for the Spring libraries, of course, are you know, framework agnostic, right? So the Spring one, obviously, because it's integrating with Spring Security, but everything else, there's no framework, there's no serious framework dependencies. So we have a JWT library that uses JJWT. That's sort of, you know, implementation details, and that's, again, a very small library with very few transitive dependencies. So we really try to not include a lot of bloat in our libraries. So there's a lot of great libraries out there, like Commons, you know, Apache Commons, Guava, and a few of those other libraries that have sort of historically had version problems. You know, when you switch between versions, and then you know, transitive dependency hell. So we sort of take the approach of avoid those when possible. And again, I don't have anything against those libraries. This is great. If I was building an application today, I would do that. I would use those libraries, but maybe not with a framework.
And I haven't played with it myself yet, but my understanding is that Micronaut runs on top of Spring Boot. So I'm wondering if we couldn't just drop in our Spring Boot starter and still have it work with Micronaut.
Well, while Brian was answering, I went and Googled a bit, and if you Google for Micronaut Octa, they actually have a guide for securing a Micronaut app with Octa, right?
Neat.
Which is kind of different from our question. Our question was, the Java SDKs, right? How can you use those in Micronaut? And so this is a little bit different because the Java SDK is what you talk to our user management API to manage your users and apps and things like that versus just securing an app. So as far as I understand it, they support OAuth 2. And since they support OAuth 2, we do too, and it works. And this guide here looks pretty nice on how to set everything up. And it's a lot of it's just setting the callback URLs and configuring it on Octa. And then they have a nice long application.yaml file that's the sucker's got to be 15 lines long. So it's almost like Spring Security, right, with all their configuration, because really there's 15 lines here, but there's only 3 properties that you're really entering. So that's YAML for you, right?
That's really interesting. I'm gonna circle back and see if we can't drop in our Spring Boot starter and reduce the nut that config. I bet we
Right,
can.
or make it smart, right? Because their property names are different, right? Instead of Spring Security OAuth 2, it's like Micronaut Security OAuth 2. So there might be some things we could do to make that work. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the big things our starter does, right? It just takes some simplistic properties and remaps them to the Spring standard ones.
Right. And for this one, it's got, I think, it's those 3 properties, but then it's enabling a bunch of other stuff like OAuth 2 and, JWT and logout and all that. So it's just adding a bunch of true places. So that might be interesting. But I'm a personal fan of Micronaut, and I have meant to write a blog post on it. I just haven't got a chance. I did publish a new one on Spring Boot 2.2 using Kotlin and Angular yesterday. So that one's out there. But as far as Korkis, if you Google for Korkis Octa, there we are on the top with how to develop a Korkis app with Java and OIDC. And so as far as I know, that one is developing a resource server. So it would be just an API, a REST API, most likely, that you would talk to from some other client. And like I said, if you did want to do where your backend actually requires, redirect to Octa for login, there is an OIDC plugin, as far as I know, for Korkis that should work. I haven't tried it myself, but if you are interested, please try it. Get back to me. If it doesn't work, we'll make it work. That's what we do here.
And I posted both of those links you just mentioned in the YouTube chat.
Okay. So the last question that I see here, and we only got a few minutes, so this will be the last one, is when should I use the Octa Java SDK instead of the Octa Spring Boot starter?
So we actually hear this question a lot, and I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier. And it's not even just the Java side. We get this similar question for .NET. And I even asked the question because, if I'm unfamiliar with .NET, the terms and how things are named over there are different. But essentially it comes down to, on the Java side, the Java SDK is your management task. So it's interacting with our REST API. So if you want to create users, groups, if you want to get additional user data, maybe you have a user ID and you need to pull in other user information, or update that user, or do something. You would use the SDK, or if you're automating some tasks, right? Like if you're, I don't know, you're writing some code for some CI related thing or integration testing or whatever, you could use the SDK to set up some structures or whatever. And then you would use the Spring Boot starter just for authentication.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so we got a minute or 2 left. Any of you want to have any parting thoughts on Java, Octa, or OAuth?
What's your big goal for the year? What are you excited about?
Me personally?
Yep.
Well, it's like one of those few years where the bus is done, right? So I don't have to worry about that was a 10-year goal. So I'm happy. But beyond that, I think continue to play with a lot of the new framework stuff out there, right? I'm always been a big Java frameworks fan. So Spring Boot, Korkis, and Micronaut, digging into those a little bit. I've started to write a lot more Kotlin code, and I like it. I like how IntelliJ makes it very easy for you to just copy and paste your Java code, and then it becomes Kotlin. So it's a nice learning curve. And beyond that, probably, maybe try to write a Java FX app on a mobile phone and see if that's as good as the people that are developing it say it is. Right. But I'm excited about Java. Like, Java 14 is coming out next month and no one will upgrade. But, as developer advocates, we always get to try the latest stuff and don't have to worry about production as much. So it's a nice role to have.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'm really excited about Kotlin too. So should be a good year.
Yeah, I got 3 for this year: Kotlin, Micronaut, and JHipster. I'm long overdue on getting hip to JHipster, as long as I've known Matt.
Well, and I've been working on the OAuth 2 support for reactive JHipster, so that should be coming
awesome
up next week or 2. Yeah.
Groovy.
All right. Well, thanks to all those who showed up, and we'll go ahead and end this and see you next time.
Bye, everyone.